Camp Forest, Tennessee, February 1946. The war had been over for 6 months in the way that wars are over, formally, on paper, in the language of surrender documents and occupation zones, in the way that mattered to the 14 German women who had arrived at the Tennessee detention facility in November. It had not ended so much as changed shape. They had been processed, assigned, fed, and given clean clothes. They had accepted 13 of these things. The clothes sat folded on the table in the processing room in the same position they had occupied for 3 weeks. Not pushed aside, not touched. Simply not accepted, with the specific quality of a refusal that had never been stated aloud and therefore could not be directly addressed. Lieutenant Helen Morris had been watching the table for 3 days. Sergeant McCoy had been watching the group. They had not yet compared notes, but they had reached the same conclusion from different directions. Something was wrong with the youngest one, and the tall blonde with the flat gray eyes was the reason nobody had said so. The transfer order to the main processing center in Virginia had arrived that morning. They had 4 days. If you are enjoying this video, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me where in the US you are watching this video. The clothes had been there for 22 days. Helen Morris knew this because she had counted. She was the kind of person who counted things when the things themselves refused to be explained. It was the same instinct that had made her a good nurse. The understanding that what you couldn't read directly you could sometimes read through repetition and duration. The folded dresses on the processing room table had been there for 22 days, clean and organized and untouched, and their presence had become the central fact of Barrack 9 in a way that nobody in the camp administration had a form for. She stood in the doorway of the processing room on a gray February morning and looked at the table. Behind her, Corporal Dawes said, Still, she said. I don't understand what the problem is. They're clean clothes. They've been wearing the same thing since November. I know. It's not sanitary. I know, Corporal. He exhaled through his nose, the specific sound of a man who found the situation unreasonable and was correct about that without being correct about what to do about it. He was not a bad man. He was a man whose framework for prisoner management had no category for this particular problem and was running out of patience with its refusal to become a different problem. Helen stepped into the room. The 5 women were in their usual positions, which was itself information. The way a group organized itself in a space told you who was managing the group. Ingrid Hartman stood near the window with her arms folded, facing slightly away from the table as though it were beneath her attention. She was 26 and had the quality of someone who had spent years being the most capable person in whatever room she was in and had organized her entire personality around maintaining that position. Her hair was unwashed and pulled back with a precision that seemed to be, in itself, a statement. I am aware of this. I have chosen it. Hildebrandt sat on the bench along the wall with her hands in her lap. She was 32, the oldest, a former auxiliary nurse from Dusseldorf, and she had the exhausted quality of someone who had long since used up every form of conviction available to her and was now operating on something quieter and harder to name. She was looking at the table. She had been looking at the table for 22 days in the specific way of someone who wanted something and was not going to reach for it. Trude Meyer sat beside Hilda but not close to her. She was 24, with a pragmatic, watchful quality, the kind of woman who assessed each situation for what it required from her and delivered that, and was honest with herself, if not with others, about why. She had accepted the food from the first day, the medical check, the bunk assignment. She had not accepted the clothes because Ingrid was watching, and the calculation had not yet shifted. Elsa Bauer was standing near the back wall doing nothing in particular, which was how she occupied space when she was thinking hard. She was 21, former signals auxiliary, and she had the alert stillness of someone whose primary skill was reading the actual temperature of a room rather than the stated one. She had been reading this room for 3 weeks, and the temperature was wrong in a way she could not resolve. Not wrong in the way of something dangerous. Wrong in the way of something that didn't add up. 2 different measurements that should have been the same and weren't. Clara Voss sat on the floor against the far wall with her knees drawn up. She was 18. She had been sitting in roughly the same position for 4 days, which was the thing that had pulled Helen's attention from the table and focused it elsewhere. Girls of 18 did not sit on floors for 4 days because they were comfortable. They sat on floors for 4 days because sitting upright had become more effort than it was worth. Helen crossed the room and crouched beside her. Clara. The girl looked up. Her eyes were slightly too bright in the way eyes became when the body was managing something it hadn't reported. Her color was off, not pale, a different thing, the specific flush of someone in the early stage of a fever she had been working to conceal. I'm fine, Clara said. Her German was soft and careful, and she said it with the conviction of someone who had been saying it for long enough that she had partly convinced herself. When did you last eat? Helen said. This morning. How much? Clara glanced at Ingrid. It was an involuntary look. Quick, immediately corrected. But Helen caught it and filed it with the rest of what she had been filing. Enough, Clara said. Helen looked at her for a moment longer than was clinical. Then she stood. Ingrid had not moved from the window, but her attention had reorganized itself toward the center of the room. She had the quality of someone who managed a group not through explicit instruction, but through the sustained pressure of her attention. You felt her watching and adjusted accordingly, the way people adjusted to weather. She is fine, Ingrid said. Not aggressively, simply as information. Her German was clipped and formal and entirely unhurried, the speech of a woman who had never in her life needed to raise her voice because the voice itself was sufficient. She doesn't look fine, Helen said. She is managing. We are all managing. A fraction of a pause. It is what we do. The room was quiet for a moment. Trude was looking at the floor. Hilda was still looking at the table. Elsa was looking at Ingrid with the expression she wore when she had measured a temperature and found it to be something other than what was being described. Helen looked at the table. 22 days of clean folded clothes in a room of women wearing the same things they had arrived in. A girl of 18 sitting on the floor with a fever she was hiding because the woman at the window had established that accepting American care was a form of surrender, and surrender was not something they did. She understood the situation now in the way she hadn't quite understood it before, not as a hygiene problem or a processing delay or a cultural misunderstanding, but as something structural. The clothes were not the point. They had never been the point. The point was Ingrid's hand on the group and Clara's fever and the distance between those two things, which was growing in a direction that only moved one way. She turned and walked to the door. Dawes was still in the corridor. Well, he said. Get me 3 wash basins and 2 kettles, she said. Soap from the surgical ward, towels. Dawes looked at the doorway, then back at her. Lieutenant, we're running a processing station. The transfer order is in 4 days. There are 12 other groups ahead of this one, and none of them are giving us this kind of trouble. Then this one needs 4 more minutes of my attention than the others, Helen said. Find me Sergeant McCoy. Tell him I need 5 minutes. What does McCoy have to do with wash basins? Helen looked back through the doorway at Clara on the floor and Ingrid at the window and Hilda staring at the table with 22 days of wanting something she wouldn't reach for. Right now he has nothing to do with wash basins, she said. That's exactly why I need him. He came through the door at 9:30. Sergeant James McCoy was 34 years old, from Birmingham, Alabama, and had been in the Army for 6 years, in the specific way of a man who had decided early that he would be better at this than anyone who expected him to fail at it. He was not large in the way that announced itself. He was the size of a man who had carried heavy things for a long time, and whose body had organized itself accordingly. He moved through spaces with an economy that was neither aggressive nor deferential, simply purposeful, the movement of someone who had decided long ago that a room was a room, and his job was his job, and neither of those things changed based on who else was in them. He had his clipboard. He always had his clipboard, not as a prop, but as a working document, annotated in a small, precise hand that Helen had noticed the first week, because it was the handwriting of someone who took accuracy seriously as a professional matter, rather than a personal one. He stepped into the processing room, looked at the 5 women with the same assessment he gave every room he entered, made whatever notation the assessment required, and looked at Helen. Lieutenant? Sergeant, thank you for coming. He nodded. He was already looking at Clara on the floor, not staring, just noting, the way he noted everything, adding it to whatever internal ledger he maintained about the state of the groups under his watch. Ingrid had gone very still. It was a different stillness than her usual one. Her usual stillness was controlled, the deliberate composure of a woman who managed her reactions as a matter of discipline. This was something that had happened to her body before her mind could organize a response. She was looking at McCoy with an expression that moved through several things in quick succession. Surprise, then something harder, then the specific blankness of a person overlaying a strong, involuntary reaction with the appearance of no reaction at all. She had never been in a room with a black man before. This was legible to Helen immediately, and she suspected it was legible to McCoy too, because very little about how white people looked at him for the first time was new information to him. McCoy looked at his clipboard. He read something, made a small mark, looked up. Group 9, he said, more to himself than to the room. 22 days. 23 today, Elsa said. He looked at her. She had not intended to say it. It had come out of the same instinct that made her correct temperatures when they were stated wrong. She held his look with the alert quality she brought to things that surprised her, which this did, the specific quality of his attention, which was not what she had been prepared for. She had been prepared for authority performing itself. This was something else. A man doing a job, and doing it completely, and needing nothing from the room in order to do it. 23, he said, and made the correction on the clipboard. Ingrid's composure had reassembled itself. She spoke in German, not loudly, the way she always spoke, at a volume that assumed the room would organize itself around her words. He should not be in here, she said. Elsa looked at her. This is a women's facility, Ingrid said. Male personnel require a female officer present for entry. Lieutenant Morris is present, Truda said quietly, without looking up. That is not what I mean, Ingrid said. The room understood what she meant. The room had always understood what she meant when she used that particular tone. The tone that did not say the explicit thing because the explicit thing did not need to be said to people who had been educated in the same system she had. McCoy had understood enough of the German to follow the shape of it, or he had read the room, or both. He did not react in the way Ingrid needed him to react, with discomfort, with apology, with the shuffling withdrawal that would confirm the hierarchy she was insisting on. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had encountered this specific thing many times and had arrived, through long experience, at a response that was more devastating than anger. He simply continued. He walked to the table and looked at the clothes with the same professional attention he had given everything else. He picked up the top dress, checked the size tag, set it down. He made a note on his clipboard. These are all correct sizes? He asked Helen. Check twice, she said. He nodded. He walked to the window, past Ingrid, not around her, and looked out at the camp yard for a moment. Then he turned and looked at Clara on the floor. How long has she been sitting like that? He said. 4 days, Helen said. That I've observed. She needs to be seen by the medical officer. She does. He looked at Ingrid. Not confrontationally, not with the performance of authority, with the direct neutral attention of a man identifying the relevant factor in a situation. There will be a medical assessment this afternoon, he said, in the careful German he had developed over months of this work, grammatically imperfect but entirely clear. For the whole group. This is not optional. It is standard procedure for all detainee groups at the 20-day mark. We do not require a medical assessment, Ingrid said. We are not ill. It is standard procedure, McCoy said, for all groups. It has nothing to do with your group specifically. He said it without particular emphasis, which was what made it effective. He had removed the ideological stakes from the sentence entirely. It was not care being offered. It was procedure being executed. She had no framework for refusing a procedure that wasn't directed at her. She said nothing. He looked at the clipboard once more, made a final notation, and looked at Helen. 5 minutes, he said. You have something else. The wash station, she said. This afternoon, before the medical assessment. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man connecting the pieces of something he had been watching develop for several days. You need me at the wash station. I need you in the corridor outside it, she said, visible from the doorway. He understood this immediately. She could see that he understood it, and his face did the thing it did when he processed something and accepted it without requiring further explanation. He looked back at the room. At Ingrid, at Hilda still looking at the table, at Elsa, who was watching him with the open, measuring attention of someone revising a calculation in real time, at Clara on the floor. 1400, he said. I'll be in the corridor. He walked out. The room was quiet. Ingrid turned back to the window with the careful composure of a woman re-establishing a position she felt had been tested. She was holding something she would not name because naming it required an admission she was nowhere near ready for. Elsa looked at the door McCoy had walked through. She was thinking about his face. Not his expression. His face itself, the simple physical fact of it, the complete ordinariness of it in a way that her brain kept trying to resolve against 17 years of being told what that face meant, and what it signified and what it indicated about the man behind it. She had no resolution available. The man had walked into the room, done his job with complete competence and complete dignity, corrected a number on his clipboard because she had given him accurate information, and walked out. She had been told her whole life what to see when she looked at a face like his. She had looked. She had seen a sergeant with a clipboard doing his job. She sat with this for a long time. The fever had started on the 4th day after arrival. Clara knew this precisely because she had been counting, not the days of the camp, not the days since the war ended, but the days of the specific heat that had settled behind her eyes and across her shoulders like a hand pressing down. She had counted because counting was something she could do quietly, inside, without anyone seeing, and quietly inside was the only space she had managed to keep entirely her own since November. She was 18 years old and had been a signals auxiliary for 14 months, recruited at 17 with the specific enthusiasm of a girl who had grown up believing that the work was important, and the cause was real, and that both of these things meant something about her own importance and reality. She had stopped believing this somewhere in the last 3 months of the war. Not in a single moment, not through any particular revelation, but through the slow accumulation of what she had seen and transmitted and been asked to process and file and never discuss. She had not told anyone she had stopped believing it. She had not told anyone about the fever either. The reason for the first silence and the reason for the second were not entirely different. Hilda had noticed on the second day. She had said nothing because Hilda had learned over 32 years that the timing of what you said mattered as much as the content, and the timing for this particular thing was not yet right. She was a former auxiliary nurse, and her body still ran the automatic diagnostics of someone trained to read physical states in people who were not reporting them accurately. Elevated temperature, reduced appetite. The specific way Clara held her head slightly forward, which was what people did when the base of their skull ached. She had watched and waited, and the timing had not become right. That afternoon, Elsa sat beside Clara on the floor. Not to interrogate, just sat, the way you sat beside someone to indicate that the space between you was not contested. Clara looked at her sideways, and Elsa looked at the wall opposite, and for a while, neither of them said anything. "The sergeant," Clara said. "Yes," Elsa said. "He was not what I expected." "No." Clara picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. "I don't know what I expected exactly. Something from the posters. Something that matched the posters." "It never matches the posters," Elsa said. "That's what posters are for." Clara looked at her. "When did you know that?" Elsa thought about it honestly. "Slowly," she said. And then all at once. They sat with this. Outside the window, the Tennessee afternoon was moving through its pale February light, the camp going about its business, a truck crossing the yard, 2 soldiers talking near the gate with the relaxed posture of men who were cold but not suffering. Ordinary, the ordinary that kept insisting on itself no matter how hard you looked for something else. "Elsa," Clara said. "Yes." "I haven't been well." Elsa looked at her. "I know." "For about 4 days." "I know." A beat. "Hilda knows too." Clara absorbed this. "No, no," Elsa said. "Ingrid doesn't know because Ingrid has not been looking at you. Ingrid has been looking at the table and the door and the sergeant and everything that threatens the position she has decided to hold. She's trying to protect us," Clara said. And it came out with the quality of something rehearsed, a sentence that had been true once and was being maintained past the point of its truth, because abandoning it required abandoning too many other things at the same time. Elsa looked at her with the patient expression she reserved for temperatures that were being stated incorrectly. "Clara, the sergeant said the medical assessment this afternoon is standard procedure for all groups. Ingrid said we don't need it. Ingrid is not a doctor. Ingrid is not running a fever." Clara looked at her hands. The loose thread had come free, and she was holding it between 2 fingers without knowing what to do with it. "If I go," she said, "she will say I cooperated. She will say I gave them what they wanted." "What they want," Elsa said carefully, "is to process 14 women and transfer them to Virginia on schedule. They want this finished. The medical assessment is not a trick. It is a man with a clipboard making sure nobody boards a transport truck with a condition that should have been treated 3 days ago." "You sound very certain." "I am certain about the fever," Elsa said. "I am certain about McCoy. I am certain that Hilda has been looking at those clothes for 22 days and not reaching for them because Ingrid is watching. And that is—" She stopped. She looked at the wall. "That is not protection. That is something else wearing the same coat." The room had been quiet enough that the conversation had carried further than either of them intended. Trudy, from the bench, said without looking up, "She's right." Ingrid turned from the window. The temperature of the room changed in the specific way it changed when Ingrid's full attention arrived. not threatening, not loud, simply present with the weight of a person who had spent years being the one whose attention mattered most. "Clara does not need an American medical assessment," she said. "She needs rest. She has been resting. She will continue to rest, and she will be well before the transfer. She has a fever," Hilda said. It was the first time Hilda had spoken directly to Ingrid in 4 days. She said it the way she said everything now, without inflection, without challenge, simply as a fact that existed regardless of whether anyone found it convenient. "You don't know that," Ingrid said. "I was a nurse for 3 years," Hilda said. "I know that." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room in which something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Ingrid looked at Hilda with the expression she used when someone had moved outside the structure she maintained. Not angry, something colder, the assessment of a person recalculating what they had assumed about someone's position. Trude stood up from the bench. "I am going to the medical assessment," she said. "That is my decision." "Trude," Ingrid said. "It is my decision," Trude said again. She was not defiant about it. Defiance would have implied she was asking for permission and withholding it. She was simply stating what she was going to do with the flat, final quality of someone who had finished calculating and arrived at the number. "Mine too," Hilda said. She stood. Ingrid looked at Elsa. Elsa looked at Clara. Clara was still holding the loose thread between her fingers. She looked at it for a moment, then set it carefully on the floor beside her, the small gesture of someone putting something down that they no longer needed to hold. "Help me up," she said to Elsa. Elsa stood and took her arm and helped her to her feet. Ingrid said nothing. She turned back to the window and looked out at the campyard and the February afternoon, and held her position with the specific quality of a person who has just watched the room move without her, and is not yet ready to name what that means. Helen had the wash station ready by 1:30. The camp laundry room was not large, but it had what she needed: a drain in the floor, a hot water line, enough space for 3 basins set on the long wooden table that ran the length of the near wall. She had requisitioned the soap from the surgical ward herself, carrying it in a canvas bag through the cold corridor with the specific efficiency of someone who had stopped asking for permission and started asking for materials. White sheets hung on the wire lines that normally held drying linens, sectioning the room into something that approximated privacy. Wooden stools, towels folded in a stack. 2 kettles of water on the small iron stove in the corner, not quite boiling, the right temperature for hair. Nurse Evelyn Price had come without being asked, which was characteristic of her. She was 27 and from Georgia and had the direct, practical quality of someone who had grown up around a lot of people, and learned early that most problems yielded to the application of organized effort, and that the main obstacle to organized effort was usually someone deciding in advance that the effort wasn't worth making. She looked at the basins. She looked at Helen. "How many?" "5, Helen said. "Possibly 4. Evelyn understood the arithmetic. "The tall blonde. She'll come or she won't. We start without her." At 5 minutes to 2, the door opened and Trude came in first, followed by Hilda, followed by Elsa, supporting Clara, whose color was worse in the afternoon light than it had been that morning. Trudy looked at the basins and the steam and the folded towels with the expression of someone whose calculation had just been confirmed. Hilda looked at the basins and something crossed her face that she organized away quickly, but not before Helen caught it. Wanting something. 23 days of wanting something she hadn't reached for. "Sit wherever you're comfortable," Helen said. She said it in German, careful and unhurried. "There's no order to this. We start when you're ready." Nobody moved for a moment. Then Trudy pulled a stool to the nearest basin and sat down and looked at Helen with the direct expression of a woman conducting a transaction she had decided to conduct. "Fine," she said. "Start." Helen rolled up her sleeves. She worked the way she worked everything, methodically, without performance, her hands moving through the practical sequence of wet and soap and rinse with the competence of someone for whom this was simply what the next hour required. Trude sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the white sheet partition opposite, and said nothing. The water ran dark into the basin from the first pour, weeks of road dust and smoke and the accumulated residue of a winter that had not included adequate washing facilities. Trudy's face did not change. She received it the way she received most things, as a process to be gotten through. Then Evelyn started on Hilda. Hilda sat on her stool, and Evelyn placed a towel over her shoulders and picked up the pitcher, and Hilda closed her eyes. She kept them closed for the entire process. When the warm water came over her hair, she made no sound, produced no visible reaction, simply sat with her eyes closed and her hands in her lap, while Evelyn worked the soap through with the careful attention of someone who understood that the physical task and what it meant were two different things occupying the same space. At the third basin, Elsa settled Clara onto a stool. Helen came over as soon as she had finished with Trudy. She looked at Clara directly and took her wrist for a pulse, not asking, simply doing it with the professional ease of someone for whom taking a pulse was as ordinary as taking a temperature. "How long?" she said. "4 days," Clara said. "Perhaps 5. Helen nodded. She released her wrist and placed her palm against her forehead and then her cheek. "You should have come to me on the first day." "I know," Clara said. Helen looked at her for a moment, not with reproach, with the expression of someone who understood exactly why a girl of 18 in that particular room had not come on the first day and was not going to spend time on it now. She picked up the pitcher. Clara flinched when the warm water touched her scalp, not from pain, from the specific shock of warmth applied to a place that had been cold and unwashed for too long, the nerve endings registering something they had not been offered in months. Helen worked slowly, more slowly than she had with Trudy, because she could feel the tension in the girl's neck and shoulders, and understood that it needed time to go somewhere before anything else could happen. Elsa sat on a stool nearby and watched. She was watching Helen's hands, the way they moved through Clara's hair without impatience, working through a knot with a careful separation of fingers rather than a pull, the functional tenderness of someone who had been trained to handle people who were in pain and had internalized the training to the point where it was simply how her hands worked. Elsa thought about her mother, the kitchen in Zwickau, Sunday mornings before the war when her mother had washed her hair over the sink with the same unhurried hands, the same warm water, talking about nothing in particular because the talking was not the point. She looked at Helen. Helen was not her mother. She was an American Army nurse in a camp laundry room in Tennessee, doing a job that her orders did not technically require her to do. She was doing it because she had assessed the situation and decided it needed doing, the same way McCoy had decided Clara needed a medical assessment, the same way the guard on the ship had decided a sick woman needed medicine. The same structure, Elsa thought, appearing in different forms, not a system producing outcomes. People inside a system making individual decisions based on what they saw when they looked. She was still thinking about this when the door opened. Ingrid stood in the doorway. She looked at the room, the basins, the steam, the white sheet partitions, Hilda with her eyes closed and a towel over her shoulders, Trudy examining the ends of her clean wet hair with the focused attention of someone conducting a quality assessment, Clara with her head tipped forward under Helen's hands. Her face did the thing it did when the room had moved without her, the rapid recalculation, the reassembly of composure over whatever was underneath it. She walked in. She did not take a stool. She stood near the door with her arms at her sides, not folded, which was her usual posture, just at her sides, which was something different. She looked at Clara and Helen. She looked at Hilda. She looked at the basin nearest to her, the empty one at the end of the table, the stool placed in front of it, the clean towel folded over its back. Nobody said anything to her. Helen did not look up from Clara's hair. Evelyn moved to the kettle and refilled the third basin without acknowledging Ingrid's presence, not from rudeness, but from the practical wisdom of someone who understood that the only wrong move in this moment was to make it a moment. Ingrid stood at the door for a long time. The room continued around her, the sound of water, the smell of soap, the low voices of Trude and Evelyn exchanging 3 words about the temperature of the rinse water. Ordinary sounds. The ordinary that kept insisting on itself. Then Ingrid walked to the empty stool at the end of the table. She sat down. She did not ask. She did not signal. She simply sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the white sheet partition in front of her and waited with the careful composure of a woman doing something for the first time and permitting no one to remark on it. Helen looked at Evelyn. Evelyn picked up the pitcher without expression and filled it from the kettle and carried it to the end of the table and placed a towel over Ingrid's shoulders. Ingrid said nothing. The warm water came. Clara went down at 2:20, not dramatically. There was no warning sound, no visible moment of decision. She was sitting on the stool with Helen's hands still in her hair, and then she was not sitting on the stool. She slid sideways with the slow, boneless quality of someone whose body had simply finished negotiating and submitted to what it had been managing against for 5 days. Helen caught her before she reached the floor, one arm across her chest, the pitcher clattering into the basin. "Evelyn," Helen said. Evelyn was already moving. They lowered Clara to the floor together. Helen's fingers went to her neck. Pulse present, elevated. The fever that had been a contained problem was now the kind of problem that had a different set of responses. Clara's eyes were open and confused in the specific way of someone who had been somewhere else and was finding their way back. "I'm here," Helen said. "You're on the floor. You fainted. Stay still." "I'm sorry," Clara said. "You have nothing to apologize for," Helen said. She looked at Evelyn. "Get McCoy." Ingrid stood up from her stool. She had been sitting with the towel still over her shoulders, her hair half washed, one side clean and the other not. She pulled the towel off and dropped it on the table and stepped toward Clara with the expression of a woman whose composure had been replaced by something more fundamental. Not ideology, not position, something older than both. Concern, raw and unguarded, for a girl she had been responsible for. "What is wrong with her?" she said. The German was fast and uncontrolled, stripped of the careful register she usually maintained. "Fever," Helen said. 5 days untreated. "She needs the medical officer immediately." "What will he do?" Ingrid said. "Examine her. Treat the fever. Determine if there is an underlying infection." "She does not need an American." Ingrid stopped herself. She looked at Clara on the floor, the flushed face, the shallow breathing, the two bright eyes tracking the ceiling with the unfocused quality of someone whose temperature was doing things temperatures should not do. She looked at Helen's hands on Clara's wrist. She looked at the room. Something moved across her face. Not the recalculation she performed when the room moved without her. Something slower. Something that went deeper than calculation. "She does not need to leave this room," Ingrid said. "Treat her here." "I am a nurse," Helen said. "The medical officer is a doctor. I cannot treat a fever of this level without a physician's assessment and authorization." "Then you assess her." "I have assessed her. She needs a doctor. She needs to stay here." Helen looked up at her from the floor with the expression she used when she had finished negotiating and was communicating that fact. "She needs a doctor. Those are not competing requirements. I can get her a doctor in this room if that is what it takes." The door opened. McCoy came through it at the specific pace of a man who had heard what he needed to hear from the corridor and had already completed his assessment before entering. He looked at Clara on the floor. He looked at Helen. He looked at Ingrid standing between the door and the girl. He took in the geometry of the room in about 4 seconds. "Medical officer," he said to Evelyn. "Going," she said, and was out the door. He looked at Ingrid. She was directly between him and Clara. Not deliberately. She had moved toward Clara, and he had come through the door, and the room had arranged itself this way without anyone planning it. But she did not step aside. She held her position with the rigidity of someone who had committed to a stance before fully understanding what the stance would cost. McCoy did not move toward her. He did not raise his voice. He stood in the doorway with his clipboard under his arm and looked at her with the full, level attention of a man who had decided what was going to happen and was giving her a moment to decide whether she was going to be part of it or not. "Ma'am," he said. The German was careful and direct. "The girl on the floor is sick. I'm going to make sure she receives medical care. That is what is going to happen in the next few minutes." "You have no authority over what happens to these women," Ingrid said. "I have authority over the health and safety of every detainee in this facility," McCoy said. "That authority comes from the United States Army and the Geneva Convention, and I have been exercising it every day for 8 months. It does not change based on who is in the room. She does not want American medical care. She is unconscious," McCoy said. "She is not expressing a preference. I am expressing it for her." McCoy looked at her for a moment, not with anger, not with the performance of patience, with the specific quality of a man who has been presented with an obstacle that he finds neither surprising nor acceptable, and is now simply deciding how to move past it. "No," he said. "You are not." He said it the way he said everything, at a volume the room required and no more, without inflection that invited argument, as a statement of fact rather than a challenge to be met. He walked past her. Not through her, not aggressively, simply past her, the way you walked past something that was in your path when you had somewhere to be. He crouched beside Clara. "Can you hear me?" he said in German. "Yes," Clara said. "The doctor is coming. You are going to be fine. You do not need to do anything right now except stay still." "I'm sorry," she said again. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said, which was exactly what Helen had said. And Clara looked at him with the expression of someone receiving the same information from an unexpected direction, and hair pulled back with the same precision as always. She came out from behind the partition and walked to the window and looked out at the camp yard, and nobody said anything to her, and she said nothing to anyone, and the morning continued. Elsa watched her from the bench. She was not watching with the analytical attention she usually brought to Ingrid, reading her for temperature, for what she was managing and what she was suppressing. She was watching with something quieter, something closer to the attention you gave someone you had known in one way for a long time, and were now seeing in a different light that did not erase the first light but existed alongside it. Ingrid had sat on the stool. She had let the warm water come. She had done it last and alone and without asking, and nobody had watched because Evelyn had understood that nobody should watch, and that was its own kind of statement about the people in this room. Not the German women, the Americans, who had understood without being told that the last woman to the basin needed the grace of not being witnessed. Trude found Hilda in the corridor after breakfast. "You knew," Trude said, not accusingly, simply as an observation that wanted confirmation. "I suspected," Hilda said, "from the first week, that it would be like this. That it would not be what we were told," Hilda said. "Those are not the same thing. I didn't know what it would be. I knew what it wouldn't be." Trude looked at the corridor wall. "I cooperated from the first day because I calculated that cooperation was the intelligent position. I told myself it was strategy. And now," Hilda said, "now I think it was strategy and also the right thing, and I am not entirely comfortable with the fact that those two things happened to align." Hilda looked at her with the first expression in 3 weeks that was not exhausted. Almost a smile. "That discomfort means you are thinking honestly," she said. "Most people spend their whole lives making sure those two things align and never noticing that they've done it." Trudy absorbed this. "Ingrid," she said. "Ingrid will take longer," Hilda said. "She built more. She has more to take apart." "But she sat on the stool." "She sat on the stool," Hilda said. "That is where it starts." McCoy did his morning rounds at 7. Elsa watched him from the window of Barrack 9, his circuit of the yard, the clipboard, the 2 soldiers at the gate he stopped to speak with briefly, the check of the perimeter fence, the notation made, and the pace resumed. Unhurried. Systematic. The rounds of a man who took the ordinary maintenance of order seriously as a matter of professional commitment rather than performance. She had been thinking about what she had been told. Not for the first time. She had been thinking about it since the first morning, since the boots on the Americans in the doorway and the guard on the ship and the orange juice in the glass. But she had been thinking about it differently since yesterday. Since McCoy crouching on the laundry room floor beside Clara with his clipboard set aside and his hands flat on the concrete, and his voice at the register you used with someone who was frightened and needed to not be frightened. She had been told what he was. She had been given a complete and detailed account of what he represented, and what his presence signified, and what it meant about a society that had produced him and placed him in a position of authority. She had received this account in classrooms and through radio broadcasts and in the language of posters and official publications, and the steady ambient instruction of a state that had understood very well that if you wanted people to see something specific when they looked at a face, you began early and you repeated often, and you left no competing information available. She had looked at his face. She had seen a sergeant. She had seen a man who walked into a room and did his job completely, and returned to his post and came back when it mattered, and crouched on a floor beside a sick girl and told her she had nothing to apologize for. She had seen a man who had been given every reason by the history of his own country to look at a group of German women and feel something other than professional responsibility, and who had looked at them anyway with professional responsibility, complete and unperformed. She understood that this was not a small thing. She understood that what it cost him to do this, to be decent in that room, to those women, in that uniform, in that country, with his own history pressing on him from every direction, was not the same as what it cost him. Ingrid stood behind him. She was looking at the back of his head, at his hands on the floor beside Clara, at the way he had spoken to her, at the apology he had dismissed with the same words Helen had used, the same instinct, the same complete absence of the transaction she had expected care to come wrapped in. She had expected conditions. She had been prepared for conditions. You may have this if you give us that. You will be treated well if you perform gratitude. Your dignity is available in exchange for cooperation. She had been managing these expected conditions for 23 days. There were no conditions. There had never been any conditions. McCoy was crouching on a laundry room floor in a Tennessee detention camp talking to a sick German girl he had never met before this afternoon, his clipboard set aside for the first time since Helen had known him, and he was doing it because she was sick and she was in his facility, and those two facts were sufficient reason. No further reason was required. No exchange was implied. Ingrid looked at his hands on the floor beside Clara. She looked at the stool at the end of the table where she had been sitting with one side of her hair clean and one side not, the dropped towel, the half-empty basin. She looked at Hilda against the wall, standing with her arms at her sides and her clean, damp hair, and an expression that said she had known this would happen and had been waiting for it for 23 days. She looked at Elsa. Elsa was looking back at her with the patient expression she wore when she had measured a temperature and was waiting for the reading to be acknowledged. The door opened, and the medical officer came through with his bag, and McCoy stood and stepped back to give him room, and Clara was looked at and assessed and pronounced ill, but not dangerously so. A respiratory infection that had been given too long to establish itself. Treatable, manageable, requiring rest and medication and the application of organized effort that Evelyn had always believed most problems yielded to. McCoy picked up his clipboard. He stood near the door and watched the medical officer work with the attentive stillness of someone who had done his piece of this and was now making sure the rest of it happened correctly. Ingrid sat down on the stool at the end of the table. She sat with her hands in her lap and the damp towel still on the table beside her and the half-clean hair, and said nothing for a long time. Then she looked at Evelyn, who was standing nearby with the pitcher of warm water still in her hand. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Evelyn refilled the basin and came to the end of the table and picked up the towel and placed it back over Ingrid's shoulders, and Ingrid sat still and looked at the white sheet partition and let the warm water come. Clara slept through the rest of the afternoon and most of the night. She slept in the way that people slept when the body had finally been given permission to do what it had needed to do for days. Deeply, without movement, the specific heaviness of someone who had put down a weight they had been carrying past the point of reason. The medical officer had left medication and instructions and a follow-up assessment scheduled for the morning, and had been entirely professional about all of it, which Hilda had noted with the quiet attention she brought to things that confirmed what she had already concluded. By the following morning, the clothes were gone from the table. Not all at once. They had been taken over the course of the night and early morning, individually, without ceremony, each woman behind the sheet partition, and then out again in the plain cotton dress and borrowed shoes that were slightly too large for most of them. Nobody marked the occasion. Nobody made a comment about the table or the 23 days or what it meant that the table was now empty. It had the quality of a collective decision that everyone had made separately and in private, and that required nothing additional from anyone. Ingrid's dress was plain gray. She wore it with the upright posture she wore everything. Her Dallin, which was not nothing but was a different kind of weight. He had carried something she had not been asked to carry and had done his job anyway, and had not required a single one of them to acknowledge what that meant. She watched him complete his circuit and stop at the gate and make a notation and move on. She thought about the posters. She thought about the face on the posters and the face she had looked at in the laundry room and the distance between those two things, which was not a distance that could be explained by context or circumstance or the softening influence of proximity. It was the distance between a lie and the thing the lie had been constructed to replace. She had been carrying that lie for 17 years. Standing at the window of Barrack 9 in Tennessee, watching a man with a clipboard do his rounds, she set it down. The transfer order came through on the third day. Virginia, a larger processing center. Final documentation before eventual repatriation. The female officer explained the schedule in careful German, answered questions, moved on. Trucks at 0700, 1 bag each, standard procedure. The morning of the transfer, Clara asked permission to speak to the nurses before boarding. The camp commander nearly refused on grounds of schedule, and then thought about it for a moment, and approved on grounds of something he did not specify, but that had the quality of a man who had watched the last 3 days from a distance, and understood that some things were worth the 4 minutes. The 5 women stood beside the truck in the early morning cold, bags in hand, collars turned up. The sky was pale, and the air smelled of pine, and the camp was going about its morning with the unhurried routine of a place that had processed many groups, and would process many more. Helen and Evelyn came out together. Clara stepped forward. She was still pale, still slightly diminished from the fever, but standing straight with the specific quality of someone whose body had been given what it needed and was doing what bodies did when that happened. She was holding something wrapped in a piece of cloth. She held it out to Helen. Helen unwrapped it. The wooden comb, one of the ones from the wash station, simple and utilitarian, the kind of object that had no value except its function. "Keep it," Helen said. Clara shook her head. "For the next girl," she said. "Maybe she will think she is beyond cleaning too." Helen took the comb. Clara looked at her for a moment and then did something that was not in any regulation or protocol or framework for the management of prisoner transfers. She stood straighter and met Helen's eyes and said in careful English that she had probably learned in school long before the war had broken the world. "Thank you for not looking away." Helen held the comb. The truck doors closed. The convoy moved out through the camp gate and onto the Tennessee Road, and the pine trees closed behind it, and the camp returned to its mourning. McCoy was at the gate with his clipboard, checking the transfer manifest against the departure time. He made his notation. He watched the truck until it was out of sight, and then looked back at the yard and continued his rounds with the same pace he always used, unhurried, systematic, the ordinary maintenance of order conducted by a man who took it seriously. He did not know what had happened in the laundry room from his particular position. He knew the facts of it, the medical incident, the treatment, the resolution. He did not know that Elsa had stood at a window and watched him complete his circuit and set something down that she had been carrying for 17 years. He did not know that Ingrid had sat on a stool at the end of a table and let the warm water come, and that this was where something had started that would take her a long time to complete. He did not know that Clara had kept a wooden comb for 3 days specifically to return it. He was a sergeant doing his rounds on a February morning in Tennessee. He had done his job. He had done it the way the best of them always did. Not for recognition, not for the record, not because history was watching, but because a girl was on a floor and needed a doctor, and that was sufficient reason and the only reason required. He checked his clipboard. He moved on.